You know what they call a quarter pounder with cheese in Paris?
They don't call it a quarter pounder with cheese?
Oh man, they got the metric system. They wouldn't know what the quarter pounder is.
And what do they call it?
They call it Royale with cheese.
Royale with cheese.
Why did America never adopt the metric system? I literally think it's because America is just so big. Unlike Europeans, most Americans have never left their country, nor do they need to. You don't have a reason to learn the metric system because you never come into contact with it. The only foreign country it's normal for Americans to have visited is Canada, and while Canadians have metric units on their highway signs, in practice, if you ask them the distance to somewhere, they'll give it in miles. Not the same as being a Brit who goes on holiday in Spain and has to figure out how many kilos their carry-on weighs. But maybe there's something fundamental in the English speaker's psyche that gets us to prefer fiddly, fiendishly complicated units of measurement. We speak a fiddly, fiendishly complicated language, too. Our friends in the Anglosphere aren't exactly pious parishioners at the Church of the Meter. Again, in Canada, the UK, and Australia, even though they went metric decades ago, the people there don't like using metric measurements, and there's a similar story from across the pond that makes the Brits look like the irrational ones, where Americans used a simple, easy-to-do math with powers of 10 system since the very beginning, and it took Britain shockingly long to do away with their ridiculous system. Money. If you speak English, you're probably familiar enough with the word sixpence. Sing a song of sixpence, the moon and sixpence. And at one point I had the thought, wait, Britain has a coin worth 6 pence? That doesn't make any sense. There are 100 pence to a pound, right? Well, yes, there are now. That's the way almost all currency works now. There are only 2 legal national currencies in the world that aren't subdivided into 100 units. The Ouguiya of Mauritania, which is subdivided into 5 koums, and the Erieri of Madagascar, which is divided into 5 Irimbilanya. And in both those cases, inflation has rendered the 1/5 denomination so worthless they don't make coins for them anymore. But the Brits don't make sixpence anymore either, and until not too long ago, in the grand scheme of things, sixpence made a lot more sense as a coin denomination than 5 pence. British currency used to be weirder than you can possibly imagine, until that all ended on Decimal Day. I'm your host, Tor Parsons. These are my co-hosts, Jalby the Durian, Thimble the Doll, and Sluds the Shoggoth, and welcome to Tor's Cabinet of Curiosities.
Gone are the days when 12 old pence added up to make a shilling, not much sense. The half crown too has gone for good, a coin that foreigners never understood. Now some people who were feeling very bright have put their heads together just to make things right. They have made it easy for every citizen, cause all we have to do is count from 1 to 10. We call it decimalization, decimalization. Soon it's gonna be time to change the money round, cause we got decimalization, decimalization. There's 100 new pennies now for every pound. We call it decimalization, decimalization. There's 100 new pennies now for every pound. D-E-C-I-N, Halalisation.
In its simplest terms, currency is a unit or object accepted society-wide for the purchase of goods and services. Throughout history, grain, precious metals, specialized handcrafts, tools, and other naturally occurring but rare objects like cowrie shells have been used as proto-currencies. On the Pacific island of Yap, money took the form of giant donut-shaped stones, which got their value from being quarried on faraway islands from kinds of rock that weren't found on Yap, and then taken to Yap by canoe. Once they got there, they were too heavy to move, so when they were quote-unquote spent, they'd usually just stay in the same place under a new owner. In fact, if one of these stones fell off the canoe after it had gotten most of the way to Yap, it would still be considered valid currency, even when its physical location was at the bottom of the ocean. The libertarian economist Milton Friedman noted that this isn't as weird as it sounds to modern Westerners. Gold in bank vaults works the same way. It has value because we've decided it does, and it changes hands, typically, without any of its owners actually ever seeing it. Our modern system of coinage emerged in the Eastern Mediterranean around the 7th century BC, when local authorities began commissioning lightweight circular tokens made of copper, silver, or gold, stamped with a seal of authentication. This system spread throughout the Western world, taken up by the Achaemenid Persians, Macedonian Greeks, and then the Roman Empire, with the values and denominations of coins evolving on a local level over the centuries, based on the value of precious metals they could mine and smelt around there, and the kings and governments that minted them. China had its own system of coinage, which emerged on its own, roughly at the same time as the system in the Near East. That system, interestingly, bears a stronger resemblance to modern 21st century monetary systems, but in terms of its historical influence, it was mostly confined to East Asia. Would love to talk about that at some point. That is not what this video is about. By the early medieval days, currency in Western Europe was a patchwork. Although the barbarian kingdoms that filled the power vacuum continued minting Roman coins, sometimes in the very same former Roman mints, the use of coins as regular currency would die out in the ensuing centuries, although Roman units would continue to be used in accounting. The widespread revival of coins began in the 7th century, when the Merovingian Franks began minting their own currency, denarii, a name borrowed from the Romans. By convention, 12 denarii would be the equivalent of 1 solidus, another former Roman coin still used as a unit of accounting. Later, under the Carolingians, the empire of Charlemagne, and sort of the precedent to both modern France and modern Germany, the convention emerged that 20 solidi, or 240 denarii, was the equivalent of a pound of silver, with a pound in this context being roughly equivalent to the Roman unit of mass, the libra. Silver is heavy, so 1 pound of it would be a hefty but not massive coin. And of course, libra is the reason the pound as a unit of weight is still abbreviated LB. The division of the libra into 20 solidi and the solidus into 12 denarii worked well on a mathematical level. For everyday transactions, 12 denarii allowed the solidi to be easily divided into halves, thirds, and quarters. For large-scale transactions, 240 denarii allowed the libra to be easily divided into a whole array of fractions. This also makes sense when you consider that base 10 and decimalized mathematics wouldn't really catch on in Europe for nearly another millennium, when it was imported to Europe from the Arab world and popularized during the Renaissance. We call the digits that we use Arabic numerals for a reason. Those weren't invented in Europe. A lot of European languages had base 20 systems in just the words they used for numbers. Everyone who learns French asks themselves at some point, why do the numbers get so weird above 70? Why is 70 literally 60-10 and then 60-11, 60-12, and then you get to 80 and it's 4 20s? That's because French used to count in base 20. At the time that we're talking about, Europeans were still using Roman numerals, and doing math with those is a pain in the medulla. Seeing as in the minds of most medieval Europeans, numbers just kept getting longer as they increased instead of rolling over and adding a zero, the easy dividers the Carolingian system created just made sense. The Carolingian monetary system would spread throughout the empire and the various polities it traded with under Charlemagne. As his empire broke apart, its various successor states began issuing their own currency based on the LSD system, no relation to lysergic acid diethylamide. As the minting of coins picked up again over the remaining millennium of the medieval period, the local libra, solidi, and denarii coins were introduced throughout Europe. Later on, other coins would be introduced, representing various multiples and combinations of LSD currency. Like in most of Europe, in medieval England the only coins minted were pennies, the British unit of denarii. Over the course of the late medieval period, as the English state became more centralized and minting increased, new coins were introduced to facilitate day-to-day trade. First, the groat, worth 4 pennies or pence, was introduced, later joined by the half-groat, worth 2 pennies. Then, in response to the practice of physically cutting pennies into halves and quarters, which people would do at the time, the crown minted halfpennies, half pennies, and farthings, a fourth thing, as in a quarter. During the early modern period, international trade became a bigger deal, and soon merchants were lugging around heavy sacks of coins that were never designed to be used in such high-value transactions. So, parallel currencies began to be minted and circulated throughout Europe to better facilitate larger transactions. Examples include the Dutch guilder, the Italian ducat, and the Spanish dollar. By the way, lots of words for currency come from the place where the metal was originally mined to make the coins. The word dollar comes from what was once one of Europe's main silver mines, in a town that's now in the Czech Republic, but was then a German-speaking area, known as St. Joachim's Valley, or Joachimsthal. The Holy Roman Empire minted silver coins known as Joachimsthalers, which later got abbreviated to thaler, then borrowed into Spanish and later on English as dollar. Meanwhile, England and France stuck relatively closely to the old Carolingian system. The denarius became the denier in France and the penny in England. The solidus became the sou in France and the shilling in England. And the libra became the livre in France and the pound in England. These in turn had several regional variations within the countries where they were minted. In France in particular, several regions had the right to mint their own coins, but you could spend them all over the country, and despite being all based on the LSD system, they had varying exchange rates depending on where you were. In fact, there was no clearly defined line between what was legal tender and what wasn't. From about the Renaissance to the early 19th century, no matter where you were in Europe, several different currencies were in circulation, and which one was quote-unquote official in your town was only decided based on which one people used more. The LSD system, as it would end up being known in modern times, gradually fell into place over the course of the Tudor and Stuart periods in England, with shillings and other higher denomination coins being introduced, while the old groat eventually fell out of favor. Initially, gold coins were introduced as a parallel currency for larger transactions, but those got folded into the LSD system as well, originally based on approximate exchange rates, and then made official when it turned out everyone was using them that way. In 1707, England and Scotland became the United Kingdom, with the English LSD system officially becoming the British LSD system. By the 18th century, where today's story really begins, this is where British coinage stood. The smallest unit of currency is a farthing.
Oh boy, 1 whole farthing!
2 farthings make a halfpenny. As you can guess, 2 halfpennies make a penny. So is it going to be a base 2 system? Is the next step up a coin worth 2 pennies? Well, sort of. There was a coin worth 2 pennies, called a tuppence, also a word you'll still sometimes hear. But then there was also a 3-pence coin, a threepence. Not making that up. Then there's a 6-pence, which is the actually important coin because we're in base 12 now. 2 6-pence make a shilling. So there's 12 pence to a shilling, or 48 farthings, although nobody counts in farthings. Okay, so we're in base 12, right? Is the next step up 12 shillings? No, the next step up is 2.5 shillings. 2.5 shillings, or 30 pence, make a half crown, written as 2/6d, d for denarii, 2 shillings and 6 pence. Naturally, 2 half crowns make a crown. A crown is worth 5 shillings, or 60 pence, or 240 farthings, but again, nobody counts in farthings. And lastly, 4 crowns make a pound. A pound is a unit of currency, while the 1 pound coin was called a sovereign, or more colloquially a quid, which you'll still hear today. Oh, and one more thing, I'm not done. I once had a dream where the US government introduced a $105 bill, and everyone was like, what? Little did I know Britain literally had that for hundreds of years. There were also gold coins called guineas that were worth 1 pound plus a shilling. Just don't ask, it's fine, it's fine, the guinea's fine. Makes sense, right? Snark aside, the system is much easier to understand when you consider that for the vast majority of British history, the primary unit of currency used in everyday life was pence. As I said earlier, 12 is an easy number to work with, and dividing pennies into halves and quarters really isn't much different than how ordinary people who don't use the metric system would navigate inches. For Americans, it's not hard to visualize things in inches, half inches, quarter inches. The most berserk element of the imperial measurement system is 5,280 feet to a mile, but when's the last time you actually had to measure feet to a mile? The system had its obvious downsides in accounting, though, which became apparent by the time that base 10 decimal mathematics had permanently cemented itself in Europe. Measuring and calculating financial transactions in a system that is simultaneously base 4, base 12, and base 20 is cumbersome. The various other European systems, which had evolved over the course of the medieval period, had a similar problem. So, when did the Europeans decide to move to decimal currency? The Enlightenment, of course.
D-E-C-I-N, Hail-I-S-ation!
The first Western currency to decimalize was the Russian ruble under Peter the Great, who reorganized his realm's Baroque system of coinage so that the existing ruble would be divisible into 100 copper kopecks. Later in the 18th century, new decimalized currencies would be introduced in the United States and France, following their respective revolutions. All three cases involved a new regime that strongly emphasized the need for modernization and efficiency, and nowhere was that truer than France. Post-revolutionary France decimalized their currency, but they decimalized a lot of other things too. This is a bit of a tangent, but one that I've wanted to have the opportunity to talk about on Tor's Cabinet for years. In pre-revolutionary France, same as in all of Europe, units varied depending on where you were. The toise was a length similar to a meter, but a toise in Paris wasn't the same length as a toise in Lyon or a toise in Bordeaux. There was a longer measurement called a lieu, analogous to the British league, which was 3 miles, but how many toises there were in a lieu also varied from place to place. A livre, the measurement of weight derived from the Roman pound, varied by up to 20% from city to city, or even between different markets in the same city. Some places would have an iron bar in the church or town square designating the local standard for a toise. The revolutionaries, armed with their faith in the new gospels of science and reason, decided to make a new standard based on something that wasn't subject to the whims of the king or local lords, something universal and unchanging: the measurements of the earth itself. 2 surveyors were sent out to map the distance from the north to the south of France, from which they would derive the total distance from the equator to the North Pole. Divide that by 10 million, and you have the new revolutionary unit of measurement. The surveying process was a shit show. It began right as France sunk into the Terror, a period when thousands were guillotined for not being loyal enough to the revolution, when you were encouraged to rat out your neighbors and they were guilty until proven innocent. Despite having letters from the government explaining their work, the surveyors were arrested several times by local authorities who didn't understand what they were doing. Back in Paris, some of the scientists who had initially been assigned with creating the new measurement system fell on the wrong side of the revolutionaries and had their heads snipped. But at last, the surveyors finished the job, and in 1798, for the first time in the Western world, there was now a universal standard for distance, one that could be used anywhere and had those easy base 10 denominations: the meter. The revolutionaries didn't stop at decimalizing the currency and decimalizing measurements of distance. Those were new and radical for the era. From there, it's not that much more of a leap to decimalize time. 60 minutes to an hour, 24 hours to a day, 7 days to a week, those are impossible to do math with, and they're arbitrary ways humans have decided to slice and dice the movements of the Earth and Sun. We can change them. You can just do things. For a few years, in the mid-1790s, France ran on decimal time, with a 10-hour day, a 100-minute hour, and a 100-second minute, none of which, of course, were exactly the same as our hours, minutes, and seconds. Decimal hours were over twice as long, decimal minutes were about half again as long, and decimal seconds were pretty close but slightly shorter than standard seconds. Midnight was 10 o'clock, midday was 5 o'clock. 2 decimal hours later, you might get off work at 7 o'clock, which we would know as 4:48 p.m. Now, you can't decimalize the year. Having approximately 365 and a quarter days in the year is not a human invention, but the year of the revolution being 1789 was a human invention, and one that the revolutionaries were determined to change. The Gregorian calendar was based on the birth of Christ, or at least when medieval monks estimated the birth of Christ must have happened, and Christianity was a silly superstition that had no place in the new rational republic. 1789 was designated as Year 1, and a new simplified calendar was put into place, with 12 months of 30 days each, plus 5 extra days at the end of the year for festivals, and a leap day as needed. Each month was divided into 3 10-day weeks, so every date on the calendar would always be the same day of the week. The year began at the fall equinox, which makes sense to me, you know? That feels like something is starting and something is ending, more than any other time of year to me. Each month had a romantic name inspired by the seasons. The month roughly corresponding to February was pluvieuse, which came from the word for rainy. August was thermidor, implying heat, and each season's months rhymed with each other. For example, spring was germinal, floréal, and prairial. Summer was messidor, thermidor, and fructidor, and so on. A few people have made translations of what the month names would sound like in English. I wanted to make a translation of my own, and then I thought these season-related names are very specific to the weather and culture of France. Like, they have a month in the fall called Vendémiaire, which comes from vendange, meaning the harvesting of grapes for wine. That's the most important thing going on in the fall in France. So I decided I'd make my own names for the months of the French Revolutionary calendar, but based on the seasons of my homeland, of Oregon. Not particularly different climates, similar latitudes with the ocean to the west, but distinct enough. So, here's what the French Revolutionary calendar months would sound like if it was in English and the French Revolution happened in Oregon. We start at the fall equinox with Filbertine, for filberts, which are hazelnuts, followed by pumpkine and frostine. Winter consists of ice crust, fog dust, and rain gust, followed by spring, which is puddle days, flower days, and itching days. Then summer is cricket trill, berry hill, and smoke fill. Also, in the real historical French Revolutionary calendar, every day of the year was named after a plant, except the 5th, 15th, and 25th day of each month, which were named after animals, and the 10th, 20th, and 30th, which were named after tools. And then in the month of Nivose, specifically, spanning mid-December to mid-January, the days were rocks and metals instead of plants. This daily naming system was because in the old Catholic calendar, every day of the year had a patron saint, so the revolutionaries wanted a secular version of that, one that glorified the humble peasant. My birthday, July 25th, or the 7th of Thermidor, is Armoise, which in English is called mugwort. That's fun, I like that. It's funny what catches on and what doesn't. Decimal day-to-day timekeeping, the 10-hour day and all that, was promoted for less than a year before it began to fall away, and within a decade after the revolution, almost nobody used it anymore. The revolutionary calendar was a little more successful, still in use as the main calendar in France up to about 1805, meaning that there was a period of several years where most French people counted hours with the old system and years with the new system. Ask someone the day, and the answer could be the 26th of Brumaire, the day of the pistachio, but you ask the time and it could be 11 p.m. The metric system, well, you know that one was successful, but it took a long time to fully catch on, and in 1812, Napoleon responded to nostalgia for the old system of measurement, or lack thereof, by introducing a new measurement system based on the old one, with units like the toise for distance and the livre for weight, but now standardized across the kingdom, and defined relative to metric equivalents. Like, for example, the toise was now officially fixed as 2 meters. So the differences from the metric system were basically in name only. What else were you going to base a system of measurement on? Those weren't fixed quantities before. After a few decades, the old names fell away and France became fully metric. But the decimalization of currency? Almost no pushback. Pretty much everyone agreed that that was a good idea right away, and the French had no real nostalgia for the LSD system. Decimalization in Russia had gone relatively smoothly as well, likely aided by the fact that the base 10 system was already well ingrained in the Russian popular psyche due to the abacus, which had been introduced to the country from China during Mongol rule. Proving that decimalization was both possible and tenable, over the course of the 19th century, every other European power would follow suit in decimalizing their currency. Except Britain. Proposals for decimalizing the pound had been made by British intellectuals as far back as the early 17th century, not long after the use of base 10 mathematics had reached British shores, and while the classic LSD system was still in the final stages of its evolution. The first serious proposals for decimalized currency emerged in 1816 amidst debate over the Silver Coinage Bill. The British Treasury had been suffering from both the metal shortages and financial strain caused by the Napoleonic Wars, and with Napoleon now roundly defeated and exiled to St. Helena, Parliament set its sight on putting things right again. During the debate, First Secretary to the Admiralty, J. Wilson Crockett, proposed that while the nation was working to resume regular minting, the opportunity could be taken to decimalize the coins as well, stating it would be almost unpardonable for the legislature at this time to reenact and legalize anew these barbarisms in the division of our own coins, which were attended with great inconvenience. The proposal was brushed off by the government, but proved to be the start of a decimalization movement in Britain that kept bubbling up from time to time. The mantle of the decimalization movement was taken up again in 1824 by Member of Parliament Sir John Wriothesley. In a motion before the House of Commons, he proposed that, quote, "As money is the medium of commerce, it is the king's prerogative, as the arbiter of domestic commerce, to give it authority, or make it current." His proposal argued for the creation of a, quote, "double shilling," which would divide the number of shillings in a pound from 20 to 10. Likewise, 2 shillings were already worth 96 farthings, so he would slightly devalue the already minuscule farthing to make a double shilling worth 100 farthings. The final product would thus be a pound divisible into 10 double shillings, or 1,000 farthings, or mills, coming from the Latin word for thousand, as in a millennium. Beyond this, some of the smaller coins would also have to have their values changed, everything less than a threepence, but the rest of the currency could stay as is, retaining its worth in proportion to the pound. Likewise, the present currency could remain in circulation until new coins were minted, in units of mills. In response to Wriothesley's motion, fellow MP and Master of the Mint, Thomas Wallace, conceded that accounting would be easier under a decimal currency, but that the inconvenience of reforming the currency would make it more trouble than it was worth. Unlike J. Wilson Crockett, Wriothesley was a relatively obscure figure in British politics who lacked the clout to push the issue. Although Wriothesley withdrew his motion, he did so with the caveat that he trusted the young members of the House would live to see the principle of his measure carried into effect. Alas, decimalization would take much longer than one human lifetime. Following Wriothesley's death in 1841, the cause was taken up by his son, also named John Wriothesley, himself a prominent astronomer. The decimalization movement picked up around then with mathematicians such as Charles Babbage and Augustus de Morgan, and public intellectuals like the Lieutenant General Sir Charles Pasley coming out in favor of monetary reform. Politically, the movement began to garner interest with the reform-minded Whig Party, a liberal party who represented the main opposition to the Conservatives in Parliament. The Whig Prime Minister Lord Melbourne established royal commissions in 1838 and 1841 to investigate the possibility of Britain adopting the metric system, an alliance formed between the decimalization and metrication movements. From one of the metric commissions, the decimal movement would get one of its most important supporters, astronomer and polymath Sir John Herschel, whose father, Sir William Herschel, had discovered Uranus. The two commissions would ultimately each provide reports to Parliament, arguing for the adoption of the metric system and decimal currencies, and stating that the two reforms were inextricably linked. By the time of the second report, however, Lord Melbourne's Whigs had been voted out of office, and government interest in both movements stalled until the election of another Whig Prime Minister, Lord John Russell, in 1846. The following year, the decimal movement enjoyed its first major political victory. Dr. John Boring, prominent economist and member of Parliament, gave an impassioned speech before Parliament in favor of decimal coinage, arguing that the benefits of its adoption were both a matter of common sense and of necessity in the modern world. He advocated for the introduction of the pound mill system and the introduction of 2 new coins, the Queen, roughly the equivalent of Wriothesley's double shilling, and the Victoria, which would be worth 10 farthings or 1/100th of a pound. Vigorous debate ensued about the practicality and economic implications of these reforms, but ultimately the Chancellor of the Exchequer, or what a less grandiose country would call a finance minister, agreed to support the minting of a double shilling as a limited experiment on the path to decimalization. Although Boring's involvement in the decimalization campaign was cut short when he was dispatched as British consul to Canton in China, the government followed through on its promise to begin minting double shillings. In 1849, the first batch of new coins were minted, dubbed the florin, a name for the medieval gold coins of Florence. In turn, the half-crown, 2.5 shillings, ceased to be minted in anticipation that it would soon become obsolete. The movement's second major political victory came when, in 1853, William Gladstone, later Prime Minister himself, was appointed Chancellor of the Exchequer. Gladstone was a decimalization supporter and organized a parliamentary committee to investigate the question of decimalized currency. The committee provided the government with a report that unanimously advocated for the complete reorganization of the pound based on the pound mill system. Encouraged by the report, the leaders of the decimalization movement organized themselves into the Decimal Association, created to lobby the government in favor of currency reform and drum up support from the British public. A year after they organized, the association already boasted formal support from 245 members of parliament, which is over a third of the members, as well as dozens of other city governments, local chambers of commerce, and professional organizations. Although not a member of the association, Queen Victoria's husband, Prince Albert, was said to be generally sympathetic to the decimalization movement. Although the decimalization cause may have seemed unstoppable by this point, hurdles still lay ahead for them. The 1853 committee's report had cautioned Parliament of the steep learning curve decimalization would pose for the British public. While John Boring regularly argued that all you needed to do to understand the proposed system was look at your fingers, it wasn't quite that simple. Remember that the LSD system was literally older than the English state itself, and to everyone alive in Britain, navigating it was second nature. With the benefit of hindsight, you can also just look at the US's refusal to adopt the metric system as a clear parallel. What did the public think about decimalization? This was before the modern days of polling. Gauging the popular attitude toward an issue wasn't clear. There weren't any big rallies or protests supporting decimalization. There didn't seem to be any opposing it either. Some members of Parliament raised concerns about a panic that might ensue if the public believed their existing cash might become worthless overnight. While the decimal movement had always agreed to a transitional period where LSD coins would continue to be legal tender, there's nothing the people love more than a moral panic. To quote Gene Wilder in Blazing Saddles,
"You've got to remember that these are just simple farmers. These are people of the land. The common clay of the New West. You know. Morons."
In a meeting with his fellow decimalists, in his capacity as Chancellor of the Exchequer, Gladstone stated, "Although it is true that we have had royal commissions and select committees of the House of Commons to inquire into the subject, it has not, I think, yet gone through anything near the process of sifting in public opinion that would make it safe for the government to take any decisive steps in regard to it. Also, even though the pound mill system was the one advocated by the Decimal Association, others in the broader movement advocated for other systems. Some argued that the pound should be divided into 100 new pennies, like the French franc or the American dollar. Others, that the pound should be fixed at 250 pence and divided into 25 new coins worth 10 pence. For some reason, the supporters of this idea wanted to call the 10 pence coins francs. Others still felt that the introduction of the florin as 1/10 of a pound was sufficient reform. A change of government saw Gladstone removed from the Exchequer in 1855 and replaced with Sir Cornwall Lewis, a fellow Liberal Whig, who argued that the logistics of converting to decimal currency were still too uncertain to implement any immediate changes, especially since they weren't sure about what the public thought. The pro-decimalists in the House of Commons continued to press the matter further and, against the government's wishes, voted to organize yet another royal commission to investigate the prospect of decimal currency. In order to gain a bipartisan and hopefully unbiased perspective on the issue, 3 members of Parliament were placed in charge of the commission, all Whigs: Lord Monteagle, pro-decimalization; Lord Overstone, anti-decimalization; and J.G. Hubbard, anti-decimalization. Over the 4 years they worked together on the Commission's investigation, personalities clashed between the 3 men, with Lord Overstone emerging as the dominant personality among the 3, and Lord Monteagle eventually driven out altogether, tipping the scales toward the anti-decimalists. Under Lord Overstone's leadership, the investigation took on a unique form. A series of 65 questions challenging the merits of the decimal system over the LSD system were posed, and various prominent figures for and against were asked to write reports in response, a pseudo-Socratic dialogue, if you were. As is befitting a parliamentary memorandum on currency reform from Victorian England, these questions are dry, long-winded, and repetitive, but thankfully my co-writer Tom and I read them so you don't have to. Lord Overstone's questions do give some interesting insights into the arguments against decimalization. His main objection to decimal coins seems to be that 12 and 240 are just really easy numbers to work with. Sure, dividing 100 pence into halves, quarters, fifths, and tenths is fine, but once you try dividing into sixths, twelfths, or even thirds, the math gets messy really fast, and you end up with awkward fractional amounts that the LSD system avoids. This is especially true when you bear in mind how we're talking about transactions before the advent of debit cards, computers, and even cash registers. Lord Overstone also pointed out, probably rightly, just how much of a first world problem this all was. Was decimalization really just the cause célèbre of well-to-do liberal elites? Did the average person actually care enough about the issue to deal with the inconvenience that reform would require? The introduction of the pound mill system would have required devaluing the smallest coins, which were also the most common in circulation, likely not a huge sacrifice for the parliamentary elite who advocated for reform, but what would the optics be for the average laborer, whose annual income was less than £30 and whose day-to-day purchases were carried out with pennies and farthings?
I mean, it's one banana, Michael. What could it cost? $10?
Finally, Lord Overstone expressed concerns over how decimal coinage would interact with the imperial system of weights and measures. Lord Overstone posed the somewhat straw man question of whether decimal currency would even work concurrently with imperial weights and measures before moving on to the real questions. If we go decimal, would the British public then be forced to go metric? Are we going to exchange our inches and ounces for centimeters and grams? What do we look like to you, a bunch of cheese-nibbling surrender monkeys? Modern anti-metric attitudes may be shading how we interpret Overstone's objections to the metric system. After all, much like Lord Overstone's preference for the LSD system, the smaller imperial measurements lend themselves nicely to being broken into smaller fractions. If it ain't broke, why fix it? Even to this day, Brits hold on to their feet and inches, even in the face of metric units being actively promoted by the government. The US, too, officially passed a law to implement the metric system in 1975. This is a little-known fun fact because approximately no one used it, and by the 80s, the government stopped trying to promote it. People who do know this history will say Reagan killed the metric system, and he wasn't a fan of it, but it wasn't exactly on its way to widespread adoption before him. There are still a handful of metric highway signs, but they're rare enough to be well-known local landmarks, like this one on 580 in the East Bay that multiple Bay Area friends and family members have pointed out to me. 21 formal replies were submitted to Lord Overstone's questionnaire, then, after 4 years of debate and consideration were given to all the arguments, in 1859, the final report was published. After all the Commission's hard work, Lord Overstone's final conclusion was, drumroll please, the present system is fine.
D-E-C-I-M-A-L-I-S-A-TION.
Although the decimalization movement in Britain died with Lord Overstone in 1859, it marched on in the rest of the world. Amid the debates in Britain, its Canadian colonies adopted a new decimal currency, modeled on the American dollar. Over the course of the 1860s and 70s, the last major holdouts in Europe adopted decimal currency. The 1860s saw a brief pan-European movement advocating for the creation of an international decimal currency, in tandem with the adoption of the metric system, which was already starting to become a universal standard. In 1874, the minting of the old half-crown resumed alongside the new florin, once a beacon of hope to the decimalists. William Gladstone, once among the most prominent proponents of decimalization, declined to push the issue further, even upon becoming leader of the Liberal Party and serving 4 non-consecutive terms as Prime Minister. When a rogue member of Parliament attempted to reintroduce the topic of decimal coinage to the House in 1881, his motion was summarily defeated. On the topic, Gladstone, now Prime Minister, remarked that the decimalization argument, quote, had been thoroughly exhausted by the speeches delivered on both sides of the House, and he was, quote, sure no fresh information could be obtained after the laborious investigations of Lord Overstone's commission. Another member remarked that the House had in past times humored members possessing this hobby, and that there was less demand than formerly for the introduction of the decimal coinage system, and he expected the movement would remain in a state of comparative quiescence for a long time to come. Another motion in Parliament in 1886 was shot down by then Chancellor of the Exchequer and father of Winston Churchill, Sir Randolph Churchill, stating that, so far from facilitating elementary education or commercial transactions, the introduction of a decimal coinage might have a directly contrary effect. Proposals for an empire-wide decimal currency from Australian representatives at the Imperial Conference of 1911 were also dismissed by British leadership, with the Prime Minister H.H. Asquith alleged to have replied that if you imposed a decimal coinage in this country, you would have revolution in a week. The fact that this issue continued to be raised throughout the Victorian era and into the 20th century does indicate that, while not quite in the Overton window, the decimal currency issue continued to loom within the popular consciousness. Decimal coinage appears as a motif in Anthony Trollope's parliamentary novels, with decimal reform being the special interest of the series' protagonist, Plantagenet Palliser, perhaps English literature's greatest autist. Serious consideration of decimalization didn't re-emerge until the final months of the First World War. In 1916, H.H. Asquith, still the Prime Minister, commissioned the Committee on Commercial and Industrial Policy after the war, which did exactly what it said on the tin. Their main goal was to figure out how to reassert the British Empire's dominant place in world commerce, which had been the status quo before the war. They delivered a report to Parliament in 1918, which, among other topics, briefly touched on those old recurring questions of whether or not Britain should adopt the metric system and/or decimalize its currency. The report touched on the possibilities of either adopting the old pound mill system as well as a new one, which would have seen the introduction of a currency called the British dollar, or royal, divided into 100 units equal to half a penny. Hence, a royal would be slightly more than a fifth of the old pound. The report, while acknowledging the long-term benefits of adopting a decimal currency, felt that the change would be both inconvenient and disruptive during the country's post-war recovery, stating that it's, quote, at least as important to preserve the credit of the penny at home as to maintain that of the sovereign, meaning the pound, abroad. Despite this, their conclusion seems to have triggered a sort of Streisand effect, and introduced a wave of pro-decimalization energy in Parliament, the likes of which hadn't been seen since the 1850s. A private member's bill was introduced in the House of Lords by one Lord Suffolk, shortly after the committee's report was published and brought up for debate on June 4, 1918. The bill proposed the introduction of the pound mill system, with Lord Suffolk asserting that the suggested reforms met with overwhelming approval from, quote, the banking and business community, as well as by the general public of the whole country. The fiercest opponent to Lord Suffolk's bill was, ironically, a fellow decimalist, Lord Leverhulme. His objections to the bill were that, while the pound mill system may have been the one most favored by England's banking elite, it was not the ideal system for decimalization. Instead, he claimed the 100-cent and royal system would be the better one, retaining the penny, which had always been the bedrock of day-to-day retail transactions. He further envisioned that the First World War created an opportunity for a great reset, akin to some of the stuff international institutions talked about during COVID. He felt that Britain, as the world's pre-war financial leader, would need to reassert that position after the war, requiring the adoption of first decimal currency and then, hopefully, the metric system. Retaining the British pound would not be a source of continuity, but rather a hindrance to the nation taking its rightful place on the modern world stage. Concerns were yet again raised by small c conservatives that the public wouldn't accept decimalization, especially in the fragile world that post-war Europe was bound to be, but a pro-decimalization peer, Lord Haldane, argued that the war had changed things, and, quote, the public takes to new timings and assimilates them much more rapidly than we have been in the habit of supposing. The debate was ultimately adjourned with no plans to take it up again. However, a royal commission was called to yet again investigate the decimalization question. While this 1920 report was far more sympathetic to the decimalization cause than its predecessor in 1859, especially being able to look at the example of successful decimalization in Canada, it ultimately concluded that all the arguments about how to decimalize the currency would far outweigh the benefits of decimal currency. It included dissenting opinions in favor of both the pound mill and the 100-cent royal system, showing just how divided the pro-decimalization cause had become. So, the decimalization movement's second wave died even quicker than the first had. The question would continue to be raised on occasion over the next 25 years, but was quashed every time by the government. Britain clearly had bigger problems on the horizon. It took the end of World War II to breathe new life into the decimalization question.
D-E-C-I-M-A-L-I-S-A-TION!
The decimalization debate continued to rear its head through the 1950s, as Britain slowly recovered from World War II. It took them a while. Food rationing was worse for several years after the war than it had been during the war. At the same time, revolutionary new institutions had been put into place: the NHS, British Railways, so why not modernize the currency too? The topic was broached in a 1951 report on adopting the metric system, saying that it would be best adopted concurrently with decimal currency. The issue was occasionally raised in Parliament, but was dismissed by Labour and Conservative governments alike. The world was changing, though. Historically, banknotes, paper money, had only been printed for high-value amounts, not quantities ordinary people would pay for their groceries with. The practice of printing 10-shilling and 1-pound banknotes instead of coins, first introduced as an emergency measure during World War I metal shortages, was now permanent. In the face of inflation, the farthing and halfpenny were becoming increasingly obsolete as legal tender. As the British Empire was slowly being dismantled, many of its former colonies adopted decimal currencies, or at least considered it. In May 1960, the British Association for the Advancement of Science and the Association of British Chambers of Commerce published a joint report in favor of decimalization. In the report's immediate aftermath, the Federation of British Industries and the Institute of Chartered Accountants likewise came out in favor of decimalization. The cheap tabloid newspapers, the Daily Mail and Daily Mirror, both took up the charge as well, suggesting there was now finally popular support for doing away with the LSD system. By this point, with Britain nearly a century behind every other world power, it was clear that decimalization was inevitable, but serious concerns were raised. Does this mean abolishing the pound? By now, the United States had clearly eclipsed the UK as the world's leading capitalist superpower, but the pound continued to offer a sense of continuity and stability to the financial world. As was the case in 1920, the debate came down yet again to the method of decimalization. Under mounting pressure from both Parliament and the public, in December 1961, Conservative Prime Minister Harold Macmillan appointed a committee to investigate the question, to be chaired by the Earl of Halsbury, a bipartisan member of the House of Lords with standing in the fields of finance, science, and administration. Unlike the previous committees and commissions, the Halsbury Committee was not tasked with determining if Britain should decimalize its currency, but how. The if was a done deal by this point. Both the previously suggested pound mill and 100-cent royal system were scrapped, because both of those were based on farthings as the smallest unit of currency, and by the 1960s, you couldn't get anything for a farthing anymore. The mint itself had stopped producing new farthings in 1956, and they ceased to be legal tender the year before the Halsbury Committee was convened. It was decided that either the shilling or the pound be retained as the primary unit, to then be divided into 100 subunits. The pound, as previously stated, was the historic unit used to represent Britain in international finance. By the 1950s, the shilling was the main unit for daily retail transactions. Retaining one unit would create complications for the situations where the other was used. I don't know if anyone proposed calling the smaller unit shillings instead of pennies, so instead of 20 shillings to a pound and 12 pennies to a shilling, you'd just abolish calling anything a penny, and now there would instead be 100 shillings to a pound? but I think that would just be too confusing. The Halsbury Committee also brought in other experts that no previous decimal activists had even considered. The Applied Psychology Research Unit of the Medical Research Council was tapped to forecast how the average person would struggle to adapt to the decimal system. The Ministry of Labor was consulted on the implications decimalization could have on wages and retail prices. Considerations were given to the cost it would take to update cash registers, adding machines, and the primitive computers that banks and more businesses were starting to use. The committee's final report came out in 1963, with the majority of members in favor of retaining the pound over the shilling. They recommended the final implementation take place sometime between 1967 and 1970. With the report's publication, however, the debate over which decimal coinage system to implement soon trickled down to the press. Frenzied debate took place in the newspapers over the decimal currency. Most major papers were for it, but many expressed concern about abolishing the shilling. The decimal reform stalled for a few years as the new Labour government felt that there were more pressing issues to deal with, but the Chancellor of the Exchequer and future Prime Minister James Callaghan insisted the issue wasn't dead. Finally, in March 1966, Callaghan announced that the government would introduce a bill to implement decimal currency, based on the existing pound, with the changeover to be finalized by 1971. It's an interesting historical accident that the LSD system of finance was abolished right at the exact moment in history when LSD started to mean something else. The pound was retained and pegged to its original value, while the new decimalized cent was dubbed the new pence for sake of continuity. The abbreviation for the new pence was P, rather than the old Latin-derived D for denarius, which had still been the main abbreviation for pence all the way up to decimalization. The shilling was eliminated entirely, bringing its existence to an end after over a millennium of use. In terms of new coins, seeing as the pound retained its pre-decimalization value, they didn't need to print new pound notes or strike new pound coins. 5, 10, and 50 pence coins were introduced in the late 1960s as a transitional measure, and were equivalent to a shilling, florin, and the 10-shilling note, respectively. Likewise, the half-crown and halfpenny, which lacked a clear decimal value, were discontinued and withdrawn during this time. The new decimalized pound was officially introduced on February 15, 1971, Decimal Day, or, as the public came to call it, D-Day. Despite the 150 years it had taken to get here, historians remarked that the transition ended up going much more smoothly than anyone expected. New coins worth 1 pence, 2 pence, and half a pence were released on D-Day in 1971. Replacing the lower value coins in daily life. The old currency remained legal tender while new coins were minted and entered circulation, with old coins now having a value equivalent to 5/12 of their value in pence under the old system. While the penny and threepence were immediately withdrawn from circulation because their value didn't fit neatly into the decimal system, other coins, like the old shilling and the florin, held out into the early 1990s. I can also offer a slightly human side to this story as well. My co-writer on this episode, Tom, asked a few British expats in his life, for whom decimalization was in roughly living memory, what they remembered about the transition. First, 2 friends who emigrated to Canada in the 1960s. Linda, who moved as a schoolgirl with her family, and Pamela, who came as a young mother with her husband. Although both had left the UK by the time decimalization came in, both had family still in England when the change came over. Linda remembered her granny being excited for the changeover and eagerly collecting the new decimal coins as they were introduced. Pamela said her relatives back in England remarked on how much more expensive all the prices seemed to be after they were decimalized in 1971. This sentiment was echoed by Tom's co-worker, Samantha, who grew up in post-decimal England, but whose mother recounted how jarring it felt to see the new prices. Tom also consulted his mother's cousin, Wendy, who grew up in England in the 60s and 70s, but now lives in Australia. When asked about D-Day, she said, "I was the first year of school to be taught in decimal. I remember it clearly. I remember the day we changed currency from shillings to pence. All the shopkeepers and ourselves would say, 'That's 12 new pence, please.' The abbreviation was NP for a few years, until we just used P and referred to it as pence. There was much grumbling from my nana when we decimalized. I remember my dad bought several coin books from the mint with the new coin currency displayed, as he loved collecting coins. I am such a terrible Philistine that I snuck some of them when I wanted to buy comics or books. We were a bit stuck at Christmas for the tradition of slipping a lucky sixpence into the Christmas pudding. The lucky person who got the slice with sixpence had good luck for the year. The 5-pence coin didn't seem so romantic or effective.
D-E-C-I-N, Hallisation!
So, why on earth did it take so long? The vast majority of the major European powers decimalized in the mid-19th century, and the closest outlier apart from the UK was Portugal in 1911, but even that's slightly misleading. Portugal only had one unit of currency, the real, which since the 18th century had been grouped into tens, hundreds, and thousands. Think instead of $5,000, it was thought of as $5,000. Beyond that, the major wave of decimalization took place between the French Revolution and the 1870s. One explanation, put forward by both contemporary anti-decimalists and later historians, is that for most countries, decimalization was part of broader reforms undertaken during revolutions. While plenty of countries did decimalize in the wake of revolution or similar upheaval, enough outliers exist that it's clearly not something you need a revolution for. Canada, Australia, and the Scandinavian countries all decimalized during periods of relative stability. The ruble, the granddaddy of all decimal currencies, was decimalized at the height of Tsarist absolutism. Obviously, internal infighting over the best means of decimalizing the pound played a part in delaying currency reform. Even into the 1960s, there was no massive outcry from the people demanding decimal currency. The issue was largely one of high finance and political science. Especially in the Victorian era, the decimal cause was one for the absolute nerdiest of nerds. It only makes sense then that intense infighting and the narcissism of small differences would prevent the debate from evolving to a point where it would generate interest outside of academic salons and obsessive treatises. There's a lesson in there for a lot of movements. Perhaps the bigger issue facing British decimalization was that Britain had a good thing going and nobody wanted to mess it up. You may remember from my episode on Zheng Yisao that the Spanish dollar was the world's first global currency, accepted everywhere in the early modern period, from Europe to the 13 colonies to China. From the collapse of the Napoleonic Empire to the Second World War, the British pound occupied a similar place. It was a safe currency, guaranteed by the world's leading financial superpower. If a decimalization scheme damaged Brits' faith in the pound, it would threaten a currency that the British Empire used to exercise soft power on a global scale. There's also the fact that for the vast majority of the British population, using a non-decimal currency was less inconvenient than introducing a decimal currency, even if in theory it would be more efficient. The LSD system had been in use for nearly 1,000 years by the time even the earliest fringe calls for decimal reform emerged in Britain. For generations, people had simply learned how to navigate the system from childhood to the point that it was second nature for them. Another argument that's often overlooked by historians looking back on the long, protracted history of decimalization, Britain's unique relationship with the continent. For reasons debated by political scientists, the British Isles have never felt quite comfortable being lumped in with the rest of Europe. This has been exemplified by the UK's tendency to not play nice with the rest of the European Union. The backlash against EU attempts to impose metric uniformity onto their economy, the hesitancy to adopt the euro or join the Schengen area, and the biggest blow-up of them all, of course, Brexit. One can't help but wonder just how much of the anti-decimalization sentiment in Britain can be attributed to not being like the continent, or worse yet, the French. The failure of the metric system to really catch on in the United States, and to a lesser extent in the rest of the Anglosphere, is another interesting parallel. Like decimal currency, the metric system is clearly the world's universal standard by this point, and way more straightforward than imperial units. In spite of this, the United States has held out, with 12 inches in a foot and 5,280 feet in a mile. Today, even 50 years after the metric system was first adopted in Canada, most Canadians would rather give up their hockey and universal health care before letting someone measure their height in meters. And woe betide any metric fanatics who try to swap out an Englishman's pint for a half-liter. In the 2000s, there was even a loose association of grocers willing to risk being fined or even going to jail over refusing to sell their wares in metric quantities. They called themselves the Metric Martyrs. One of my favorite nonfiction books ever, and one that I wholeheartedly recommend you read, is Seeing Like a State by James C. Scott. and I wholeheartedly recommend it even though I don't think it accurately describes today's world. Seeing Like a State goes over dozens of cases like the one I described during the French Revolution, where a new regime took power and decided they needed to standardize everything. Those silly peasants are using measurements that aren't even consistent from town to town. As modern enlightened folks who know how the modern world works, we'll help them by putting together a universal system. And then the new system, while simpler and easier to do math with than the one that came before, invariably fails to make the public's lives better because it disrupts existing patterns of knowledge that were there for a reason. One size never really fits all. James Scott, a card-carrying anarcho-primitivist and former CIA informant in what seems to have been a bit of youthful reverse rebellion, contends that this is because standardizations like these are never done with the public in mind at all. A state needs its populace to be legible. They have to have uniform rules and an understandable, somewhat controllable economy, first and foremost so they can tax and conscript people. Unified measurement systems, schools, clocks, and standardized time, dictionaries and academies that determine how languages are properly spoken as opposed to just speaking local dialects, maybe even all the way back to the very invention of currency, writing, and agriculture itself. According to Scott, all of those exist because they were imposed on an unwilling populace to make them easier to rule. I might describe Seeing Like a State as a book as Malthusian, not in the sense that it's saying population growth will destroy civilization, although Scott might have believed that too, but no, I think it's similar to the theories of Thomas Malthus in that it's an extremely accurate observation of the world as it was right as the Industrial Revolution was starting to get going. But as soon as the world industrialized, the author's thesis was no longer true. In the Industrial Age, standardization has, in fact, made people's lives better. Scott goes over the many examples of scientific farming techniques and modern fertilizers being introduced to subsistence-level farmers and resulting in famines and crop failures when they had been doing fine before. Sure, that has happened, but the Green Revolution in the 1960s saw scientific farming techniques and modern fertilizers introduced across the world, and it improved life expectancy for literally billions of people and reduced rates of famine and infant mortality to the lowest they've ever been. If it's possible to give a single answer to the question, what was the best thing to ever happen, I don't know if there's a better candidate than the Green Revolution. Way back in the Neolithic, the people who remained hunter-gatherers were healthier and longer-lived than the ones who took up agriculture and lived in cities, and this stayed true all the way until the Industrial Revolution gave us modern medicine in the 19th century. But standardizing the system of medical and scientific research did, in fact, deliver higher across-the-board living standards than ever before in human history. Scott admits this in the book. You can give Thomas Malthus the benefit of the doubt because he was writing in 1798. Seeing Like a State came out in 1998. But that doesn't mean Scott is wrong or that his argument is worthless. They say all models are wrong, but some are useful. When you're talking about basically any civilization before the mid-19th century, and definitely all the way up to today in some developing countries, it's a very fundamental truth that A, attempts at imposing universal standards usually don't improve ordinary people's lives, and B, governments do it anyway because the point is making it easier to tax people. Decimal Day is a very tame example of this. It was carried out to make number crunching easier in the international finance world. The public generally didn't seem to care one way or the other. Did it make anyone's lives better at any level on the social ladder? Coin collectors, I guess. Britain nonetheless saw 150 years of debate about this, because governments optimize to make the world more legible. If it also improves constituents' lives, that's an added bonus, but it's not really the point. I've said what I'm about to say several times before on this channel. I even did a whole episode of the podcast Clearer Thinking with Spencer Greenberg, mostly about this idea, but I keep returning to it because it bears repeating. I respect anarchists, but I'm not an anarchist because I'm not conformist enough. A happy and successful anarchic tribe, like the sort of world it seems James C. Scott would have preferred to live in, definitely can exist. It's probably the default mode of human organization, but without officially written rules, everyone is empowered to enforce anything that feels like it should be a rule against each other. As one person put it on the Tours Cabinet Discord, without authorities, prejudice is authority. That's why cancel culture became a phenomenon with the rise of the internet, because social media is, to some extent, an anarchic world, and where there are no cops, everyone's a cop. When you have a structure that tells you, here's what the rules are, and here's what you can expect if you violate them, then you have at least some room to defy social norms, some room to be an outcast and still be a contributing member of society. Anarchy gets used as a synonym for chaos in popular use, and a simplistic reading of Seeing Like a State will carry the message that chaos is better than order, but no, Scott's thesis is that pre-industrial societies are more orderly than we give them credit for, and I believe living in one would feel stiflingly conformist. Having some level of top-down order in society allows some level of controllable chaos, a world where weird people can find each other and avoid being ostracized, and as unpopular as it may be to defend right now, that's what the old Enlightenment liberal democracy does better than any other system I know. That's all a bit much for a video about British currency, but in an ultimately inconsequential case like this, I definitely sympathize with what James Scott says about governments making society more legible, whether the public wants it or not. Should the pound sterling be organized along lines that are easy for tourists to understand? Does it have to be? Its main purpose is for British people to buy stuff with, right? Maybe today's world is a little too streamlined. Yes, I'm more willing to defend the current global economic system than most extremely online Gen Zers. Yes, global commerce depends on some level of universal standardization, and if those trade routes went down, we'd all starve, black, white, rich, and poor. But come on, we have supercomputers and shit these days for the high caliber financial transactions. It's not that much harder for normal people to calculate prices in base 12. When I go to a foreign country, I want it to feel foreign. I want to have to ask, how many shillings are there in a half crown? And once I've gotten an answer, I want it to make me say, what the fuck? Calendars, too. International summits and things should use an international standardized calendar, sure, but we have easily enough legibility in the world as is. I want to be able to go to France, say today is August 14th, and get the response, no, monsieur, it's the 27th of Thermidor, the day of the... Oh, alright, damn, never mind.
Believe